The ocean was empty. For 9 days, the search parties saw only blue, an endless, mocking blue. Planes crisscrossed the sky, their pilots scanning the horizon until their eyes burned. Below, destroyers cut through the waves, sailors with binoculars pressed to their faces, searching for anything. A glint of metal, a splinter of wood, a spot of oil on the water. They found nothing. It was as if the sea had been wiped clean. Where a 542-foot ship should have been, there was only the void. The USS Cyclops, a titan of the American Navy, was gone. This wasn't just a boat, it was a floating fortress of steel, a colossal collier longer than 1.5 football fields, built to feed the fleet's hunger for coal. But on its final voyage, it wasn't carrying coal. It was carrying something far heavier, far more dangerous. 10,000 tons of manganese ore, a dense, shifting, unforgiving cargo loaded deep in its belly. Every wave that struck the hull would have made that immense weight shift, groaning against the steel plates. The ship was a beast, but it was a wounded beast, carrying a stone in its gut. And on this beast, 306 men lived and worked. They were fathers, sons, husbands. Some were seasoned sailors who knew the Atlantic's every mood. Others were young men on their first tour, dreaming of home. They were engineers in the roaring heart of the ship, cooks in the galley, officers on the bridge. They trusted the steel beneath their feet. They trusted their captain. They had no idea that for every single one of them, the clock was ticking down to zero. The man in command was Captain George W. Worley, and he was a problem. His crew whispered about him. They said he was a tyrant, ruling the ship with an iron fist. He would pace the bridge for hours, a man consumed by his own authority. But the rumors went deeper. Some sailors, and even some officers, believed he was a German sympathizer, a traitor. This was 1918. America was at war with Germany. To have a man of questionable loyalty in charge of a naval vessel was unthinkable. The tension on board was thick enough to cut with a knife. Was the enemy outside the ship, or was he standing on the bridge? The last time anyone heard from the Cyclops was March 4th, a routine radio message sent from near Barbados. The message was simple: weather fair, all well. No hint of trouble. No mention of engine problems, though they knew one of its engines was already damaged. No mention of the strange captain. No mention of the crushing weight in its hold. Just all well. And then silence. A profound, absolute silence that stretched for days, then weeks. The ship was scheduled to arrive in Baltimore on March 13th. That day came and went. The port remained empty. The families waiting on the docks stared out at an empty horizon. When the news finally broke, the world demanded answers. The Navy was baffled. They considered a German U-boat. But the Germans, meticulous record keepers, had no log of any attack in that area. They checked their own records after the war. Nothing. They considered a massive storm, a rogue wave that could swallow a ship whole. But other vessels that passed through the same stretch of ocean, the infamous Bermuda Triangle, reported nothing but calm seas and fair weather. An internal explosion? Possible. The manganese ore could have produced flammable gases. But an explosion of that magnitude would have been catastrophic, scattering debris for miles. And the search parties found nothing, not a single life preserver, not one floating crate, not one body. It was a statistical impossibility. A 19,000-ton ship, a crew of 306, erased from the planet without a trace, without a sound, without a witness. It is one of the greatest maritime mysteries in history, a ghost story written on the empty pages of the sea. This case defies every law of logic and physics. To join us as we dive deeper into the world's most chilling and unsolved cases, you need to subscribe to the channel right now. Don't miss a single investigation. Because to understand how a steel monster can be swallowed whole, we have to go back Back to the docks in Brazil. Back to the decisions that were made. We have to examine the first fatal mistake that started a chain reaction of disaster, turning the USS Cyclops into a ticking time bomb, lost in the heart of the Atlantic. The first mistake happened on the docks in Rio. The very air was thick with a fine black dust. It wasn't coal dust, the familiar grit sailors knew. This was manganese ore. It coated their skin, filled their lungs, and settled in a dark film over the ship's railings. The Cyclops was a collier, a beast of burden designed to swallow mountains of light, porous coal. Its cavernous holds were built for volume, not for the crushing, concentrated weight of this ore. The first mistake happened on the docks in Rio. The very air was thick with a fine black dust. It wasn't coal dust, the familiar grit sailors knew. This was manganese ore. It coated their skin, filled their lungs, and settled in a dark film over the ship's railings. The Cyclops was a collier, a beast of burden, designed to swallow mountains of light, porous coal. Its cavernous holds were built for volume, not for the crushing, concentrated weight of this ore. With every swing of the crane, another ton of the dense powder slammed into the ship's belly. It didn't spread out. It settled like a solid block of lead, a dense core of immense weight. The laws of physics were screaming. The ship's center of gravity, normally low and stable, was being dragged upwards with every load. It was becoming a pendulum, dangerously top-heavy. Imagine trying to balance a pyramid on its point. The slightest push could send it toppling over. The ship was being fundamentally transformed from a stable vessel into an unstable death trap right there in the harbor. The old Brazilian dockworkers, men whose skin was leathered by decades of sun and sea salt, saw the danger immediately. They didn't need complex calculations. They watched the plimsoll line, the mark on the hull showing the legal load limit, disappear beneath the murky harbor water. They saw the unnatural way the ship listed, even in the calm port. They pointed, they muttered warnings in Portuguese. One veteran foreman, seeing a young American officer supervising the loading, grabbed his arm. "Now vai," he said, shaking his head, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "This ship, she will roll over. A coffin for you all." The officer, barely out of Naval Academy, brushed him off. He reported the local superstitions to his superior, who reported it to Captain Worley. The note landed on Worley's desk and was likely crumpled and tossed aside. Pride. It was the first fatal error. The belief that a modern American warship and its decorated captain were immune to the ancient wisdom of the sea. The second error was deep in the ship's roaring metallic heart. The starboard engine was dead. A cracked cylinder head, a catastrophic failure that couldn't be patched up at sea. It was a gaping wound in the ship's power plant. The chief engineer, a practical, no-nonsense man named Borgen, knew what this meant. He marched to the captain's quarters, schematics in hand. "Captain, we cannot make this journey," he stated, not requested. "The port engine can't handle this strain alone, not with this load. We're overloaded and underpowered. It's a recipe for disaster. We need to put in for major repairs, right here, right now." He pointed to the stress figures, the red lines showing the impossible torque being placed on the single functioning propeller shaft. Worley didn't even look at the papers. He stared at Borgen with cold, dismissive eyes. "Chief, we are at war. The United States Navy does not shrink from its duties. You will make that engine work, and you will get us to Baltimore on schedule." The conversation was over. It was an order, backed by the full weight of military law. To argue further would be insubordination. Borgen returned to his engine room, a defeated man. His crew saw it on his face. They knew. They could feel the violent shuddering of the single engine, the unnatural vibration that ran through the steel deck plates like a constant tremor. They weren't just sailing, they were torturing the ship's only functioning lung. When the Cyclops finally steamed out of Rio, it was a grotesque sight. It didn't cut through the water, it wallowed. A crippled giant, limping into the vast, unforgiving Atlantic. The moment it cleared the harbor and met the first true ocean swell, the nightmare began. The ship heeled over to port, a slow, sickening roll that went on and on. Men grabbed for handholds, their knuckles white. It hung there on the edge of oblivion for a terrifying eternity before groaning, shuddering, and sluggishly righting itself. Then the swell passed, and it rolled just as violently to starboard. Down in the mess hall, trays of food crashed to the floor. In the engine room, tools slid from their racks. Deep in the hold, the 10,000 tons of manganese shifted with a deafening, grinding roar, the sound of a mountain moving inside their ship. This wasn't the rhythm of the sea, it was a death rattle. The crew's quiet fears turned into open dread. They moved through the passageways like crabs, always holding on to something. They wedged themselves into their bunks at night, fully clothed, bracing for the lurch that might be their last. They looked at each other, and no words were needed. They were on a floating coffin, and the captain was at the helm. Then came the final, baffling decision, the move that defied all logic. Captain Worley announced an unscheduled stop in Barbados. His official reason, logged for the record, was to take on supplies and coal. But the ship's quartermaster knew they had more than enough fuel to reach Baltimore. It was a lie, a pointless, dangerous lie that made no tactical or logistical sense. This detour wasn't just a minor change of plans, it was a fatal deviation. It took them hundreds of miles off the safest, most direct shipping route. It steered them away from the protection of naval patrols and directly into the desolate, unpredictable waters that would one day become infamous as the Bermuda Triangle. Why? The question echoed in every corner of the ship. Was the captain simply incompetent? Had the stress broken him? Or was it something far more sinister? The whispers about Worley being a German sympathizer, once dismissed as barracks gossip, now felt terrifyingly real. Was he deliberately taking them into a U-boat ambush? Was this unscheduled stop a rendezvous with the enemy? The men were trapped on a ship that was physically tearing itself apart, commanded by a man they no longer trusted. An overloaded vessel, a broken engine, a paranoid crew, and a captain charting a course into oblivion. The mistake wasn't a single event. It was a chain reaction of human error, a cascade of pride, ignorance, and mystery that had sealed the fate of all 306 souls on board. Barbados was not a sanctuary. It was a stage for the final act of deception. The crew, desperate for solid ground and a moment's peace, was instead confined to the ship. They stood at the railings, watching the lights of Bridgetown flicker to life. They could smell the wood smoke and hear the distant sounds of a life they couldn't touch. It was a special kind of torture. Captain Worley gave the order himself. No shore leave, no mail sent home. The Cyclops sat in the calm turquoise water of the harbor like a prison ship. Worley went ashore alone, just once. He was seen by a local harbor master walking down a dusty road, away from the naval offices, away from the supply depots. He returned hours later, his face a mask, carrying a small, weighted leather pouch. He offered no explanation. He locked it in his personal safe. The whispers on deck turned to hushed, frantic theories. Was it payment? Was it orders from a German contact? The American consul in Barbados, a man named Livingston, came aboard to pay a courtesy call. He later reported that Captain Worley was the most disliked man he had ever met. He described the crew as sullen, their eyes filled with a quiet rage, and felt the ship was on the verge of mutiny. The consul's report was filed away, a footnote to a ghost story. It was from Barbados that the Cyclops sent its last message. The radio operator tapped out the simple words, "Weather fair, all well." It was a lie. Nothing was well, and the fair weather was about to end. As the ship cleared the island's protective embrace, the Atlantic met them with a cold, gray indifference. The long, gentle swells of the Southern Passage were gone. The sea became choppy, then aggressive. The sky, which had been a brilliant blue, turned to a bruised purple. The barometer on the bridge began to fall. And then it kept falling. The first wave didn't roll under them. It rose up like a liquid wall and crashed over the bow, a solid ton of green water that swept the deck clean. Any lingering hope was washed overboard with it. The ship's death roll returned, but this time it was worse. The waves were no longer rolling under the hull, they were punching it. Each impact was a deafening boom that shuddered through every steel plate. Down in the hold, the mountain of manganese ore began to move. It wasn't just shifting anymore. With every violent roll, 10,000 tons of powdered rock would slam against the portside wall. The ship would hang there, groaning, steel screaming under the strain. And then a wave would hit from the other side, and the entire mass would avalanche against the starboard wall. It was the sound of the ship being beaten to death from the inside. A deep structural groan, like the sound of bones breaking. The internal bulkheads, never designed for such focused, dynamic impacts, began to buckle. Water began to find its way in, not in a rush, but in 1,000 tiny leaks. Rivets, stressed beyond their limits, wept cold salt water. Seams along the hull plates began to ooze. The bilge pumps, which should have been silent, were now working constantly, a frantic, rhythmic pulse deep in the ship's guts, fighting a losing battle. The men stopped talking about home. They stopped talking about the future. They only talked about the noise, the constant, grinding, shrieking symphony of a dying ship. Sleep was impossible. Men would lie in their bunks, wide-eyed in the dark, listening to the groans of the steel, feeling the sickening lurch of the deck. Paranoia festered in the damp, cold air. Men huddled in small groups, whispering. Eyes darted to anyone who walked by. A dropped wrench in the engine room caused 3 men to draw knives on each other, convinced it was a signal for sabotage. They were separated and locked in the brig, their wild eyes a terrifying preview of what was to come. A man was accused of trying to poison the water supply, simply for standing too long near the scuttlebutt. Trust was gone. There were only factions. The chief engineer, Borgen, was a living ghost. His face, already stained with grease, was now pale with exhaustion. The single engine was overheating. The vibration had cracked a steam pipe, filling the engine room with a scalding fog. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with the smell of hot metal and fear. His men worked in near-zero visibility, their hands wrapped in rags, trying to patch a wound that could not be healed. He knew the engine was tearing itself apart. He knew they had hours, maybe a day, before it seized completely. He sent a runner to the bridge with an urgent final report. The runner came back, his face white, shaking. "The door is locked, sir," he stammered. He shouted through the steel that any man who disturbed him again would be shot for mutiny. The descent was complete. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a tomb, waiting for the sea to claim it. The crew was no longer a crew. They were inmates, trapped in a steel box, ruled by a madman, and tossed about by a merciless ocean. They were alone, utterly and completely alone. The chain of command was a memory. Hope was a forgotten language. There was only the screaming of the wind, the groaning of the steel, and the cold, dark water waiting below. The explosion happened without a sound. It wasn't fire, it was steel. A main support girder in the forward hold, tormented for days by the shifting weight, finally surrendered. It snapped with a low, gut-wrenching thud that was felt more than heard, a deep, resonant bass note of doom that vibrated through the soles of every man's boots. A vibration ran through the ship, a final death shudder. On the deck, the change was immediate and terrifying. The bow, already low, visibly dropped another 10 feet, its nose now digging into the churning waves. The ship was no longer just taking on water, it was broken. Its spine had snapped. Chief Engineer Borgen felt it in the engine room. He and his men were thrown against the scalding bulkhead as the deck tilted forward at a sickening new angle. The single engine, their last torture hope, gave a final metallic scream as its bearings seized under the impossible strain. And then, silence. The sudden absence of noise was more terrifying than the constant roar. Only the shriek of the wind and the crashing of the sea remained. Borgen looked at the faces around him, illuminated by a single swinging emergency lantern. They were young men, smeared with grease and blood from minor burns, their eyes wide with the raw animal certainty of death. The time for following orders was over. Survival was the only law left. He grabbed a young sailor by the arm, a boy no older than 19. "We're not dying down here," Borgen said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Get the sledgehammers. Get every heavy tool you can find. We're taking the bridge." They moved like a single organism, a desperate pack fueled by adrenaline. They didn't run. The lurching, angled deck made that impossible. They climbed, hand over hand, up the candid ladders, their heavy tools clanging against the steel railings. The passageways were chaos. Water was already pouring down stairwells, cold and black. Men screamed from the lower decks, their cries swallowed by the storm. Other sailors saw the mutineers coming. Some joined without a word, their faces grim masks of resolve, grabbing wrenches and pipes as makeshift weapons. Others shrank back into the shadows, paralyzed by a fear greater than their will to live. The ship was now split in two, not by steel, but by choice. Those who would die following orders, and those who would die fighting for one last impossible chance. The bridge door was a slab of reinforced steel, designed to withstand an explosion. Borgen slammed his fist against it, the impact jarring his entire arm. "Worley, open this door! The ship is sinking!" Only the howl of the storm answered. "Captain," Borgen roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "For God's sake, man, we have to get to the lifeboats!" A voice came from within, muffled but chillingly clear, cold and steady. "Return to your posts. Any man who attempts to enter this bridge will be shot for mutiny." It was the voice of a man in another reality, a captain commanding a ghost ship. Borgen looked at his men. There was no need for words. He nodded. The first swing of the sledgehammer was deafening. The steel rang like a funeral bell, sparks flying in the dim light. Another man joined, his own hammer striking a split second after the first. A brutal, pounding rhythm began. 1, 2, 1, 2. They aimed for the lock mechanism, their muscles screaming with the effort. The door buckled, groaned, but held. "Again!" Borgen yelled. The steel began to tear. Inside, Captain Worley stood at the helm, his hands gripping the useless wheel as if he could still steer. He wasn't looking at the door. He was staring straight ahead, into the black fury of the storm. He didn't even flinch as the steel behind him began to rip open. The door burst inward with a final shriek of tearing metal. Borgen stumbled in first, a heavy wrench in his hand. 2 other mutineers followed, their sledgehammers held like weapons. They stopped dead. The scene was insane. Captain Worley stood calmly, his dress uniform immaculate, not a hair out of place. On the chart table next to him, a single pistol lay untouched. He turned his head slowly, his eyes not angry, not scared, but empty, as if looking through them at something far away. "You are too late," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the storm. "She has an appointment to keep." And then the ship gave its final lurch. It wasn't a roll, it was a catastrophic plunge.
The bow dipped under a massive wave and simply did not come back up. The laws of physics, so long defied, reasserted their absolute power. The 10,000 tons of manganese ore, a solid, immovable mass, avalanched forward, tearing through the already buckled bulkheads with the force of an exploding mountain. The ship was being ripped apart from the inside out. The men on the bridge were thrown against the forward windows. For a single, horrifying moment, they saw not the sky, but the green, churning abyss of the ocean rushing up to meet them as the glass shattered inward. The Borgans screamed, a raw sound of pure terror. Worley said nothing. He simply closed his eyes, a flicker of something unreadable on his face. There was no final battle, no standoff. The mutiny was pointless.
The fight for control of a ship that was already gone. They had fought each other for the captain's chair on a vessel that was, in its final moments, little more than a coffin of steel plummeting to the bottom of the sea. The water didn't flood the bridge, it detonated it. 1,000 tons of the Atlantic punched through the glass, turning the bridge into a churning vortex of black water, steel shrapnel, and human bodies. There was no up or down, just the crushing, freezing cold and the roar of a dying ship. For the men inside, consciousness was a flash of violent chaos. The pressure wave hit first, bursting eardrums. Then the water, solid as concrete, slammed them against bulkheads, shattering bone. It was over in a second, a mercifully quick end in the heart of the chaos. The Cyclops broke in half as it went down. It wasn't a clean snap. It was a slow, agonizing tear. The sound, a low-frequency groan that traveled for miles underwater, was the sound of a metal giant being disemboweled. Rivets, thousands of them, popped like machine gun fire, their heads shearing off and ricocheting through the flooded compartments. The immense weight of the manganese ore, now a liquid avalanche of rock and water, tore the hull open, peeling steel plates back like a tin can. The forward section, containing the bridge and the broken spine, plunged bow first, accelerating into the abyss. The aft section, containing the now silent engine room, wallowed for a moment. It rolled over, exposing its red belly to the storm before spilling its heavy machinery, boilers, turbines, pistons, into the sea. They tumbled into the darkness after the rest of the ship, a final metallic offering to the deep. For a few seconds, the ship's internal lights flickered eerily beneath the waves, a string of dying stars illuminating a maelstrom of escaping air, machinery, and men being thrown into the abyss. Then, one by one, the lights shorted out, and the two massive sections of the once great vessel slid silently into the crushing darkness of the ocean floor. On the surface, a violent whirlpool formed, a swirling vortex where the ship had been. It sucked down anything that might have reached the air, a wooden crate, a lone life preserver, a sailor's cap. They bobbed for a moment on the edge of the gyre before being pulled under, erased. The ocean was cleaning up the evidence. The storm raged for another hour, its waves washing over the spot, mixing the water, hiding the grave. Then, as if its work was done, the wind died down, the sea calmed. By dawn, the water was a placid, indifferent blue. There was nothing. No oil slick, no floating debris, no bodies. The ocean had swallowed the USS Cyclops whole, leaving not a single crumb behind. 306 men were erased from the world. Their families waited. Days turned into weeks. The Navy, facing a public outcry, launched one of the largest search operations in its history. Ships crisscrossed the designated route, their crews scanning the empty horizon until their eyes burned. Early naval aircraft, rickety biplanes, flew grid patterns, their pilots looking for any sign of wreckage. They found nothing. Investigators were dispatched. They interviewed the harbor master in Barbados, who spoke of the strange, disliked captain. They read the American consul's report, which warned of a crew on the verge of mutiny. Every clue led to a dead end. They considered every possibility. A German U-boat? After the war, German naval archives were meticulously checked. No U-boat was within 1,000 miles of the Cyclops' last known position. A rogue wave? Other ships in the area reported nothing but moderate storms. An internal explosion? The debris field would have been vast, unmistakable. Yet, there was nothing. Every logical explanation was systematically dismantled, leaving only the chilling, impossible truth. A 19,000-ton warship had vanished from the face of the Earth. The official U.S. Navy report concluded that the ship was gone, and they would likely never know why. The mystery endures, a ghost story told by sailors in the dark of night. It's a story that forces a choice. Was Captain Worley a traitor who deliberately sailed his ship and crew into oblivion, a final dark act of wartime sabotage? Or was he just a proud, fatally stubborn man, blinded by duty, who made one mistake too many? Was the mutiny by Chief Engineer Borgen a heroic last stand for survival, a desperate attempt to save 300 men from a madman? Or was it an act of treason that came far too late, a pointless fight for control of a ship that was already sinking? Whose side were you on? The iron-willed commander who refused to yield, or the desperate mutineer fighting for one last chance to live? Let us know in the comments below. Somewhere, 2 miles down in the crushing blackness, the two halves of the USS Cyclops lie in the silt, a silent, undiscovered tomb holding all the answers. To make sure you don't miss our next descent into the unknown, subscribe to the channel. The darkness is full of stories waiting to be told.